Hello. Oh, it's so wonderful to be here and nice to meet you all. To give you a little introduction, so my name's Amanda Paluch. I'm a professor at UMass Amherst, and I am in the kinesiology department. Kinesiology is the study of human movement. So we study movement in a whole bunch of different ways, and I'm going to talk about how I study movement, and also I study movement and how we can use it to monitor and promote healthy living. So particularly my emphasis is on during the aging. As we age, how does movement relate to indications of our health and also how it can help us live healthy, long lives? So that's what I do in my research. So when my discussion, my main question that I do in research and what we're going to talk about today is how we can use this technology to best promote and monitor our health as we age. And so I'm going to actually do two examples of a few of my projects. The first one will be on frailty detection, and then the other one is on daily steps. So, does anyone want to take a stab at how old this gentleman is?
90. 80s.
Close?
85.
Okay, 90 is the closest right now. Keep going.
102.
That's close, a little bit lower. So Roger is, in this picture, Roger's 100 years old.
Wow.
And he was still competing in tennis tournaments at this age, and he lived to 102. And so there's a lot of factors that went into how long Roger lived. But we think that one of the main factors is how physically active he was, right? So how he kept moving throughout into his 80s, into his 90s, and then into 100 years old. So still competing. And Roger actually lived in Cape Cod. So he's a local hero for us, right? Yeah, you can see his Boston Red Sox hat, right? Yes, yes. Yes, so when we think about healthy aging, this is just from World Health Organization. So for healthy aging, it includes physical activity, so exercising regularly, and that's one part of it that I'm going to focus on today, but also recognizing that it's a whole spectrum of things that help us live healthier for longer. So making sure we're getting enough sleep, we're having good nutrition, we have social lives, we're staying connected, like doing what you're doing right now, kind of getting out and staying connected. Reducing stress, maintaining our brain health. Another thing that hopefully I'm going to help you with today, I'm going to challenge you guys, we're going to look at some research, we're going to look at some data today. So really get our minds moving and keep them active, and also kind of having those regular checkups. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about this regular checkup thing and how technology can help us kind of interact with our clinicians or help better monitor at a daily level with some of these technologies that we have. So I run the Epitech Activity Lab at UMass. So you can see that's my building. So we've just recently, over the past, this building was built just a little, it's less than a decade old. It's about 8 years old. There's this Institute for Applied Life Sciences. So what this institute does at UMass is it really takes this translational approach. So how we can use things like technology or molecules or things like that and relate it to larger perspectives, how we relate it to health. So I take technology, how do we relate it to our health? So here's what I do. So I do physical activity. I think about physical activity. And I'm an epidemiologist. So what an epidemiologist is, I think we're all getting more and more familiar with an epidemiologist from what we've gone through over the past, since COVID, right? And you've heard about these epidemiologists. So those are infectious disease epidemiologists. I'm a chronic disease epidemiologist. So I understand the risks of developing chronic diseases and how we can prevent chronic diseases through physical activity. And so I'll give an example of how we use really large population data sets and understand physical activity with health. And then I do this using wearable technology. So a variety of technology. I have a ton of different technologies in my lab. We use that to figure out how we can use that to best monitor and promote physical activity. So this is what we do in our lab. Okay, so like I said, this is the question we're going to talk about today. And the first one I'm going to talk about is this monitoring health. So before we talk about promoting health, we're going to talk about how we monitor health with technology. And I'm going to give this example. So this is an example of a grant that I've been working on just the past few years. And it's through detecting frailty in home environments. And so this is through this Massachusetts AI and Technology Center. And one of the hubs is actually based in UMass. So we have a variety of projects that are going on right now that are really centered on helping older adults live independently for longer. And it's all around this technology focus. So I partnered with this company called Butler, a geriatrician at Harvard Medical School, and we are trying to understand using technology to detect frailty. So before we get into the technology, we'll talk a little bit about what is frailty. So we all have this physiological reserve. We all have this capability. And as we age, we kind of peak, around our 20s and 30s. And unfortunately, after that, there's an inevitable decline. No matter what, our functional ability is going to decline as we age. However, there are ways that we can slow that decline, right? If we're thinking about all of those ways of healthy aging, those can help us slow that decline. And we think that if we can measure frailty and monitor that and detect that, maybe we can intervene at a sooner point so we can help understand. So what I'm talking about so this is an example. You can see a robust person, that's somebody who's not frail yet. So the top one is your green. The green one, that's somebody who is able to move around, they're independent, so you can see somebody who would be considered robust. You can see an individual who would be pre-frail, and then an individual who's frail at the bottom, okay? And what you see here is, this is what we're talking about for frailty. If an individual at these different levels, if they have their response to a stressor. So this could just be a minor illness, getting the flu, for example, having even a minor surgery, something like that. And how does somebody respond to that? So a robust person in the green, they'll see that maybe their functional ability will decline a little bit, but they're gonna bounce right back up, right? After a few days, they'll bounce back up. And we can see as we become more frail, our response to the stressor, if we experience the stressor, it's harder to bounce back. We see more of a decline, so you can see we're declining more, and then getting back to where we need to be becomes more challenging. So this is why we care about measuring frailty and intervening sooner, so that we can catch you and help you stay healthier for longer. So when we think about interventions for frailty, so this is something that I think about, particularly for these types of physical, cognitive, psychosocial interventions that can help people, individuals, to prevent the decline of frailty, right? And so we can think about it across this spectrum, depending on where you are, maintaining a robust status, and then trying to keep people from moving from pre-frail to frail, right? So all of these various interventions. But first, in order to do that, we have to think about how we're measuring frailty. So how do we measure frailty? And you all may have experienced some of these tests or components of these tests in a clinic. So the most common way that we measure frailty is with a doctor in a clinic. And this is the typical test. So this is a frailty, they call it the frailty phenotype. And you can see we do this. Has anybody done a grip strength test? Yes, right? So you might have done the grip strength test. They also ask about questionnaires. They'll ask about weight, if you have unintentional weight loss. Has anyone done one of those walking speed tests? So it's I see some head shakes. So essentially that's just that you walk across a few meters, and they want to get an idea of how quickly you can do that walk, okay? They ask about your physical activity levels. So just a questionnaire asking about, how active you are. And also a questionnaire about how do you feel throughout the day? Do you feel fatigued? Is it challenging to do things in terms of activities of daily living? So these 5 characteristics are typically how we measure it in the clinic. So you can see this actually takes a lot of time for a physician to do, so it takes time, so not everyone does it. I could see there were some people who were saying, yes, you've seen these assessments, but it's not always done because it takes time, and you need the expertise to do it, right? And keeping in mind that this is only one snapshot of somebody's frailty, right? So what if we could measure this? The clinician doesn't have to worry about it. And what if we could measure it over time continuously? And so this is where technology comes in to help us think about this. So I'm going to talk about 2 examples of ways we're doing it in our research right now. Over here, this is wearable technology. So these are things that are worn. You can wear one on your thigh. You can wear it around your hip. You've seen the ones on your wrist, right? So anything, even just like an Apple Watch. I have a Garmin on right now. And then we can think about technologies that you just install in your home. that you don't even have to wear. Okay, so I'm going to talk about these two examples and how it relates to frailty. And so it's not just our total activity. So you could imagine somebody who's moving more is less likely to be frail. So if we can monitor them through a technology, we get an idea of how well they're doing in terms of frailty. We can also get an idea of how much they're moving throughout the day, so their patterns. So for example, if somebody is taking more frequent breaks, they're able to get up and move, sit back down, get up and move, that person is less likely to be frail as well. So just the patterns throughout the day. So for example, we can see all three of these individuals are getting about the same amount of activity in total, but how they're patterning their activity throughout the day is different. So even somebody's pattern of how they're moving can be an indication. So we can use these technology to develop these mathematical algorithms that help us understand how somebody's doing in terms of frailty. I told you I was going to challenge, look at all this data, so much, right? But I want you guys to kind of focus on some of the colors that I'm going to show you here, right? So this is just an example. This is something that's worn on the thigh, right? Very simply, you just stick it on the thigh. Most people don't forget that it's even there. But you get these really awesome indications of somebody's pattern of activity throughout the day. So you can see, right, this is somebody's activity of just sitting still. You can see as they get higher up, that means they're standing, they're walking. And so this is an example of what the data looks like. So throughout a 3-day period, you get these patterns of activity. And what we've seen in our data is that they look different for a frail individual versus a non-frail individual. So this is our frail person. This is our non-frail person. Okay, so this is what we were calling robust. And what you can see is the differences in their total activity. So for this person, similar age, but you can see they have a slower gait speed when they did the test. They have a less grip strength when they did the test in the clinic that we did. And then we also had them wear these wearable technologies. And what you can see is the person who's frail has less steps, right? 850 steps versus 3,500 steps. They're also standing less often, right? About 3 hours per day of standing, and sitting more often. So they are standing less, sitting more compared to the robust person. And they're also interesting is we see more disturbed sleep for a frail individual, right? So this person's actually sleeping or spending less time lying down, right? So we see more sleep disturbances. And these types of patterns can help us. So imagine somebody has the wearable technology and we see changes. We see declines in the amount of time that they're standing or the number of steps they're taking. Maybe this is a time to intervene and we can find different ways to try to keep this person robust. So here's an example just from data. Okay, you thought that was going to be a lot of data. Hang on for this one, okay? All right, right. Don't worry about what I want you to see is just the colors. Focus on the colors. This, again, is our frail person. This is our robust person, okay? And what I want you to see is which one has more green? Green is good. Which one has more green? Absolutely. So you can see, and so this is telling us every single day is a circle. So this is what the data can show us. Every single day is a circle, and we can see this green, and it's spread throughout the day. This person is breaking up their activity. They're getting more activity. They're sitting less. They're moving more. And so we can use this type of data and help us understand how frail a person is. So by even just visually looking at it, you can see, oh, this person's less frail. This person's robust. This person's frail. They have a lot of gaps in terms of they're sitting a lot, right? And we can see particularly that there's just much more sedentary time, okay? Right? So that's how we've been trying to quantify it. This is why this type of data can give us an idea of how frail a person is. Okay, so I mentioned this, you don't even have to wear some of these technologies. So this is a company called Butler that I've been working with. And Butler's a really interesting scenario because they actually started not in the health space. So these are devices that you install in a room. So you could imagine you install it on the ceiling, over a door, and it's going to detect movement. So it's going to detect whether how much people are moving through a room and how much movement there is. So it actually was developed to give occupancy of rooms. So you could imagine a workplace, they leased a space, they want to see how much is it actually being used, how much are people using the space. That's what they're using it for, energy efficiency, operations costs. But they wanted to get into the health space. And so we're like, I think we can use this data to understand how people are moving in a room, how much they're moving. Remember those colors? Can we see, right? Can we pick up movement using this Butler technology? Can we install it in somebody's home and understand the patterns? And you can imagine, you don't have to wear it now, right? It's just in your home. You just put it up and you forget it, right? And so you can do this long-term monitoring, okay? Okay, so how does Butler work? How does this heat sensor work? It's great because you don't get identifiable information. You're just a heat blob. Can't tell who you are, right? So you don't really know exactly what you're doing. All you know is your movement patterns. So as you're moving throughout the day, how much you're sitting, how much you're standing, how quickly you're moving. And so this is what the data looks like. You know, like how much are you spending in these various times? What's the track of your patterns? How quickly you're moving throughout your space? And that's the data. So you can see it's very private, but you don't have to wear it now. You could install it and you could have you tracked for the battery lasts for over 2 years, right? So say you just want to be able to track an individual's health over time. And you can use it with a technology like this. So we're using the similar algorithms, but applying it to something that you don't have to wear. So you can see this is we're actually finishing this up. We've recruited 50 older adults across the spectrum of frailty. They're all in Massachusetts. And now we're digging into the data, and we're close to creating these algorithms so that Butler can now deploy this. And they're actually putting it in senior centers, assisted living facilities, to try to use this to help monitor frailty. Yes?
But that's isolated to one room, right?
So the great thing is you can actually install multiple throughout the entire home. Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely. So what we did for this research project is I would go in, I would do the frailty assessment, I'd give the wearable technologies, and then we'd also have an engineer who would come in and they would know exactly where to put them in the room. So they might have like anywhere from 2 to 4 sensors per room. And they're just installed. You don't even notice them. They're really sleek little things. They're like this big.
Yeah, but wouldn't you get more data from your Garand or your Apple?
You absolutely can. So that's one of the things, right? Because the thing with wearing something, it's on you all the time. For this, you have to be in your home. Absolutely. So that is one of the perks of a wearable. We think that we can you can even get an idea of how frail someone is based on how much time they're spending inside their house, right? So you could expect somebody who's less frail is actually going to be getting out, doing things, right? Just like you guys are doing right now. So we actually think less data could be an indication that that person's less frail, right? If we're capturing less time. That's a great point and a great question. Any other questions before I keep moving? No? Okay. All right. So remember, going back to our question, I'm going to do a little pivot. I'm going to talk about one other study or one other kind of project that we've been working on. All right? And so we were talking about monitoring of health, and now I'm going to talk about how technology can promote physical activity. And so what I've spent the last 20 years answering a question, my main question that I want to answer as an epidemiologist, how much physical activity do we need for health? And so I ask what kind of activity we should be doing, how much activity, how intense does the activity that we're doing need to be, and then on top of what? So can we be sitting the rest of the day and then do our, our brisk walk, and that be okay? So what else are we doing throughout the day, and how does that contribute? So our total movement. And the reason I want to ask this is because we know physical activity has so many benefits. So we call it pleiotropic. So that means that there is multiple benefits. It works on so many different mechanisms in the body. Physical activity benefits nearly every cell in the body, which is why it's such a great intervention. And it's so great as we age. So you can see there's also both immediate and long-term. I love to think about the immediate benefits because this is what gets people to start moving, right? Thinking about, like you just go get a walk and you can feel yourself, you feel better, right? You feel maybe a little bit less anxious. You also can see maybe your sleep improves that evening if you get out and get a nice walk in. We can see almost immediate benefits in blood pressure. There's also a ton of long-term benefits. So our brain health, cancer prevention, healthy weight, and a lot of these things down here in particular, this is about living independently for longer. Living independently, better bone strength, balance and coordination, so preventing falls. These are all things that are beneficial of physical activity, which is why I like to use it as an intervention. So before I talk about the technology, I'm going to give you guys a little history lesson about physical activity epidemiology. Okay, so physical activity epidemiology, it actually hasn't been around for too long. It started in early 1950s. So this field of work started in London, and there was a researcher called, he was also a cardiologist. His name was Dr. Jerry Morris. And he thought, I think physical activity matters for health. And back in the 1950s, it was really, physical activity wasn't thought of as for the health benefits. People did it if they were athletes, or people moved specifically for their jobs. It wasn't thought of as this leisure activity back then. So this was really a really big change in terms of how we thought about physical activity. So thinking about physical activity for our health. And what he did is he did this natural experiment. He took two groups that were active and inactive. And the groups he chose were London the double-decker bus transport workers. So you could imagine there's two people that are working this bus. You have the first person who is the driver, sitting all day long, right? Sitting all day long. Then you have the conductor. And what the conductor is doing is walking up and down the aisles, going up and down the steps all day long, on his feet all day long, moving. So he had this perfect natural experiment where he could compare these two groups. And what he did is he broke those into the two groups and looked at their risk of a heart attack. And what you could see is the top one is their risk of a heart attack. So you can see your incidence. So this is a person who got a heart attack, right, over time. And it was about half. About half of the people who were moving all day, the conductors, had half the rate compared to the people who were sitting all day as the drivers. So we saw that this substantial reduction in heart disease risk for the people who were moving all day long. He also noticed that even if you did have a heart attack, you were at a lower risk of dying from that heart attack, right? So that's telling us that there's some reserve, there's some ability, even if we get a heart attack, but if we're active, because of the strength of our heart, we might be able to prevent at least dying from that heart attack, right? So this was a big, big monumental shift in terms of how we thought about physical activity. Physical activity for heart health, okay? So that's one of the first studies we did. Go a few decades later. So this actually happened back in Massachusetts, a study in Massachusetts. This is the Harvard alumni study. And Ralph Paffenberger was actually mentored by Jerry Morris. And so he kind of helped continue the work. And so this is about 17,000 Harvard alumni. And what Paffenberger did is he asked people about their physical activity levels. So rather than just observing their natural, you had that, he actually went and asked, how much activity do you do, right? And what you can see is, this is our classic dose-response curve that we use in epidemiology. So I'll walk you through it. So these are your rates of deaths. These are your rates of deaths. And you can see it's broken up by age. But really what I want you to see is if you look at any of these curves, they're going down as you get more physical activity. So we see this dose-response curve. The more physical activity you do, the lower the rates of deaths, right? So this was one of the first studies done in Massachusetts, looking at actually self-reported physical activity, asking people, showing that physical activity was related to mortality risk. Being more physically active, you were at a lower risk of premature death, okay? And we've continued to do studies like this. So this is now, you have over 600,000 people in this study, and these are self-reported data, and we can see this. So this is called a spline curve in epidemiology. And what this tells us is our dose. So essentially you have your risk. As you have a lower risk, that means you're better off, right? Across this bottom, that means you have more physical activity, right? And so what you see is as you do more physical activity, you're at a lower risk of death. Yes?
Yeah, question. Physical activities, the graph show it helps, but they account for other factors. I mean, maybe that people who have more activity and less obese,
Yes.
maybe they have a different lifestyle and things like that. How is that accounted in the studies?
That's wonderful. You should be an epidemiologist. So what we do is we do this statistically, adjusting for it. So not only do we ask somebody about their physical activity levels, we'll ask them about their diet, whether they smoke or not, how much alcohol they consume, what other conditions they have. So, do they have cardiovascular disease? Do they have high blood pressure? Do they have high cholesterol? So we'll ask about all these other things that are related, and those are called confounders. And so a confounder is something that is going to perhaps influence the association, right? People who are more active are less likely to be smokers, right? So we need to account for that. And so what these models do, we adjust for it in the model. So essentially what this is telling us is that even taking into control all of those other factors, we still see an association. So that's a really great question. And so that's what we do. So we measure all the other things that matter because, of course, not just physical activity matters, but what is the association specifically for physical activity? Yeah, that's a great question.
So these graphs represent both groups. They want non-smokers, and they want that has equal weight. Then maybe graphs for different groups.
Right. Yeah. Yes. And actually, I wish I had pulled some data that actually looks at some of those things where we look at people who are smokers and non-smokers but are physically active, right, or non-physically active, and we do see that even, say, for example, even somebody who's a smoker, right, if they're physically active, their risk of mortality is lower, right? Their risk of these, because there's some independent benefit of being physically active. Even if you're a smoker, you can still have some benefits, right? Ideally, not smoking and being physically active. But if you are a smoker, you should still be physically active because there's going to be benefits.
There's also a graph with, let's say, high cholesterol, no cholesterol.
Absolutely, yeah. So we see that across the board, right? So even if you have high cholesterol, if you are, because some people are genetically predisposed to having high cholesterol, high blood pressure, even those people who are genetically predisposed to have those, if you're physically active, you are going to be better off. You're going to have those benefits. There's still some benefits. That's a great question. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So what we see here, and I'm going to go through this a little bit. So this dose response curve, it tells us several things. It's going to tell us, what I want you to notice is going from 0 to doing just some. So this is, to doing about maybe, say, 30 minutes to an hour per week of physical activity right here. You can see this amazing risk reduction. So you can see this steep slope. So that means going from nothing to something has amazing benefits. And then it starts to, you can see there's still continuing benefits until it starts to level out. So once you get to a very high amount, there's no higher risk. You're not going to get an increased risk with doing a lot of activity. You're just not going to get a lot more of those additional benefits, right? You can only lower your blood pressure so much. You can only lower your risk of conditions so much. So at that point, it starts to peter out. The recommended amount of physical activity for older adults is in this range. And so this is, you can see this is what primarily is based on for what we recommend. So I work a lot with the US government in terms of health and human services on guidelines. So how much physical activity do we recommend at a population scale? And so the physical activity guidelines are primarily based on these types of dose response curves. And so this is based on primarily self-reported physical activity. So you can tell where I'm going to start going with this technology, right? But most of our evidence is based on self-reported physical activity. We ask somebody how much activity they're doing, and then this is what we recommend. So this is our recommendation. So this is for both general adult population, including older adults. And it's 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity physical activity. So 150 to 300 minutes per week. So moderate intensity is like a brisk walk. So I like to say the talk test. So it's where you can talk with somebody if you're going for a walk, but you can't sing, right? So you're at that. That's the recommendation, right? And doing at least 2 days per week of strength training. So those are the muscle strengthening activities. It's also recommended for older adults to incorporate some balance training within your physical activity. Okay? All right, so like I mentioned, this recommendation is primarily based on our self-report data. Okay? But I like to answer the question, how do we use technology? How can technology help us? And so I think technology plays a really important role here because there's this rapid use or adoption of technology, right? So about 25%, a quarter of adults have some type of wearable technology. Yeah, there we go, absolutely, right? And how many of you have your smartphone with you today, have a phone with you today? Okay, I see, yeah, absolutely, right? Those actually track our physical activity as well. So we have this great opportunity to monitor and promote physical activity using devices. I'm going to go through that one. Okay. And the number one metric that is used in technology is steps per day. Absolutely. So that's the number one metric that is used what people use, what is monitored from devices, and what people refer to. It's the number one metric that we use. Okay. So one of my main goals is to bring steps per day as a way to promote it as a population scale. So thinking of steps per day as an optimal public health metric for physical activity. And there's several reasons for this, and you could probably name them. The use of technology, right? It's also really simple, right? We all are familiar with what a step is, and we can accumulate it throughout the entire day. It doesn't have to be this intentional, I have to get to the gym, I have to get it done. I can accumulate those throughout the entire day, which is really nice when you think about promoting it for health. Sitting less and moving more. Talking with clinicians is actually a really great way to communicate physical activity, right? So when you only have a few times, how many steps are you getting? Maybe we can increase those. So it's really great for these communication tactics as well. Okay. Is anyone from, if I was going to ask you how many steps per day do you need for health benefits, what would you say? How many steps?
10,000?
Absolutely. So, right, 10,000. If I told you that 10,000 steps actually started from a marketing campaign in Japan in the 1960s and is not based in evidence. So the 10,000 steps, but that's everybody. Absolutely, that is the common thing. So the media says it, everyone, that's how it's communicated, and it makes sense. It's such a nice, clean number, you know. For some people, they can reach it. For others, it's challenging, right? It can be really challenging. So although 10,000 is promoted, it's not based in evidence, and so we wanted to dig into it. We're like, well, if we're going to promote this number, there's got to be science to back it, right? So this was the original pedometer that started that 10,000 step myth, right? So the pedometer is called Manpo-Kai. It was developed in Japan, roughly translated to 10,000 step meter. And it stuck. It stuck. So this was in the 1960s, so over 60 years ago. And 10,000 steps has been with us as the number that we should all do. So like I said, I work with the government to create new guidelines. So this is a committee report. And we asked, okay, how many steps should we be recommending? And they said, we don't have enough evidence. So this is why we're getting it. There's no US recommendation of how many steps we need for health. So we actually have not been recommended that. So I'm going to talk to you now just a little bit about how I do my research to try to understand this, to try to actually answer the question. So how we take a question that we don't know and how we're going to use the data to help us understand and answer this question. So I'm an epidemiologist. So what I use is these large data sets. And I use this to understand, they'll measure physical activity, and then we look at these long-term health outcomes. So this is an example of a study that we did. It's called the Cardia study. We recruited about 5,000 adults, and we are able to follow them. So their baseline for this entire study, so this is typical for how an epidemiological study works. We recruit a large group of adults, and then every so often, we'll do a little check-in. We'll check in to see how their health is. We'll do a bunch of measurements. We'll ask about not just their physical activity, but their diet. We'll measure their blood pressure. We'll also see what conditions they're developing over time. And so this is a typical look of what a epidemiological study looks like. And it just so happens that at year 20, they wore a device. So they have this technology that monitored their physical activity, in particular their steps per day. And then we were able to follow them 10 years out, okay? And so this provided this opportunity, okay, we have the number of steps. Let's see how it relates to their risk of mortality, okay? And here's what we found. So in comparison, and this is actually middle-aged adults, in comparison to people who took less than 7,000 steps per day, those who took more than 7,000 steps per day had a 40 to 50% lower risk of mortality. And you didn't need to get all the way up here. The further this way you are, the more the benefit for this. So a 0.28 means there's about a 70% lower risk of mortality for people just taking 7,000 to 10,000 steps. So you didn't have to get to 10,000 steps to see a lot of these benefits. We can look at it slightly different, right? I showed you these kind of curves. So we see this same curve, and look, once we get to 10,000, most of our benefit is there, right? Or even before that. So you can kind of see this association. So this was just one group of people. Yeah?
How do you feel that more is worse? How do you feel that more steps actually give a bad?
Oh, so absolutely. So more is not necessarily worse. It's just there's not much more benefit, right? So once you get to, for this study, once you got to about 10,000 steps, if you did much more, there wasn't any additional benefit in terms of reducing your risk of mortality. So you could do more.
That actually increases.
So that's a really great question. And the reason we see this, and you'll actually see that in other studies as well, is notice kind of the shaded area is how certain we are in this estimate. So in statistics, we have our exact estimate, and then we have kind of like our range. And you can see the shaded area gets really wide at the end, which means we're not really certain of the estimates up here because there's less people. There's so few people that are up here at like 15,000 steps that you can't get a good estimate from the statistics. Yeah, that's a really great question. But from what we see is it doesn't seem to be more, it's not harmful. We just don't see more benefit. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So we found this evidence and we're like, okay, it seems like maybe you don't need 10,000 steps, okay? So how many, so let's get more people involved. And so what we did is we invited epidemiologists from all over the world. And so you can see in the shaded areas, so this is, we had 20 studies involved all over the world. And of those studies, they also had a bunch of different devices. So all these studies all over the world, there was about 15 countries represented, 20 different studies, all of these different devices. So just like that Cardia study, they wore the device, we followed them for a long period, and we looked at their risk of death and also their risk of heart disease, okay? So this is our main takeaway from this plot. Again, so we see this dose response curve. Doing more steps per day, you're at a lower risk, right? We start to go down. And what's interesting is we saw differences for younger and older adults. So older adults are in the blue, so that's about 60 and above. Younger adults are in the red, that's below 60 years old. And what you see here is that most of the benefit for older adults happens by the time you're at 6,000 to 8,000 steps per day in terms of your lowering your mortality risk. So getting 6,000 to 8,000 steps per day was considered what we thought was like the really nice range. You're gonna get the majority of the benefits if you can get to 6,000 to 8,000 steps. And notice you have to get a little bit more if you're a younger adult, okay? So around 8,000 to 10,000 if you're a younger adult, okay? The other question that I get a lot is, do I have to walk fast to get these benefits, right? How fast do I have to walk? So we tried to do this. We tried to look at this. And what I want you to see here is we do see this association. So what this is telling us is if, as we go here, like our hazard ratios, as we go here, like we see this benefit. If it's not touching the line and it's going further, that means there's a benefit. There's a benefit in terms of the number of steps. We're seeing that there's a benefit when we don't adjust for step volume, and I'll explain that in a second. When we do adjust for step volume, the association goes away a lot. So we can start to see that our lines start to cross, means we're not certain that it's actually significant. So what this is telling us is that it seems that the total volume of steps matters more than how fast you're walking them, at least particularly for associations with mortality, right? It might depend on other outcomes, so we're looking at that right now. But if you're trying to prolong life, get steps any way that works best for you. It doesn't have to be fast. Just accumulate those steps. That's what we're seeing. And remarkably, we see almost identical associations with cardiovascular disease events. So this is older adults, and we're seeing 6,000 to 8,000 steps again, right? Get 6,000 to 8,000 steps for older adults, and you're at a 40 to 50% lower risk of having a cardiovascular disease event, right? So looking at it just from a different outcome, right? So if you're, say, for example, if you're at 3,000, get to 4,000, you'll be better off. You're at 4,000, get to 5,000, right? You see these incremental benefits. Once you start to get out to 8,000, there seems to be, maybe you can get a little bit more benefit. So if you are at 8,000, keep it up, continue. And if you want to get more, that's great. You might get a little bit of benefit. If you're not there, work your way up to 6,000 to 8,000, right? Okay. The other question that I love to discuss and talk about is, does it matter which device I use, right? What type of device do I need to use? So we've been digging into this a ton, right? And looking at a bunch of different devices. They all measure steps. How similar are they? Do I have to use a specific device, or can I use whatever I want, okay? This is pedometers. You can see some Garmin, some Fitbits. And what I want to show here, remember how I was talking about if it crosses this line, that means it's not significant. We're not showing any significant differences. So meaning that it does, all of these are kind of getting close to touching this line, that means they're all pretty similar. We're getting similar step estimates from all of these different devices. So the main message is use one device, stick with it. You'll get a decent estimate of how many steps you're doing. And if you see increases in whatever step you're using, whatever device you're using, and you're using it regularly, that's a perfect device for you. It doesn't matter which device you're using as long as you use it consistently and you use the same one. Okay. All right, so some of the takeaway points, right? The health benefits start much earlier than 10,000, right? You don't have to get 10,000 to get benefits. Start wherever you are and try to just get a few more. We mentioned that curvilinear association. So those who are least active can benefit the most. So wherever you are, just doing a little bit more. And if you're starting low, just a little bit more can be incredibly impactful. And also age matters, right? We see if you're an older adult, you might not need as many steps as a younger adult. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up with just one last thing. Because one of the other things, I work with American Heart Association, and we also talk about the benefits of resistance training for heart health. And I think this is particularly important as we age. So here's an example of something that I've worked with, a statement working with a heart association. And the main message is resistance training is for everyone. You're never too old to do resistance training, and it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be at-home exercises, it could be body weight exercises, it could be very simple things you find around your home, and even very simple 10, 15 minutes twice a week could be incredibly beneficial for your health. So it doesn't have to be a lot to see these benefits. And there's a ton of benefits in terms of, we typically think of like building big muscles, right, and strength, but there's so many other benefits. All these others, it can actually help with our blood pressure, our glucose, our lipids, right, our mental health, our sleep, all of these things with resistance training that we typically might not think about. And what you're gonna see here is okay, which one should I do? Do I do aerobic? Do I do resistance? You're telling me so many things to do right now, Amanda. Or do I do both? If you can do both, even just a little bit, you get in your 6,000 steps, you do twice a week, 15 minutes on each of those, you'll be maximizing your benefits. And you can see, right, the more pluses means the better off you are. You can benefit in terms of lean mass, bone health, weight maintenance, glycemic control in particular. If we're doing both of those, that's where we're gonna get our biggest bang for our buck, right? So doing more. And particularly for older adults, right? We see resistance training tends to go down as we age, right? So less people as we age tend to do resistance training. So you can see this is 65 plus. This is the lowest rates of resistance training in the US population are older adults, right? And so when we think about specifically for older adults and resistance training, those beneficials on skeletal muscle, on our power, our strength, this is essential for our physical function, preventing falls, helping mobility, and this is what helps us keep our independence. And we're thinking about, right, what is this doing is going back to that disability threshold, right? If we keep moving, if we keep doing resistance training, taking our steps, this could help us keep above that disability threshold where we can live independently for longer. All right. So just thinking about a few take-home messages from this presentation. Resistance training isn't futile. It could be very simple. Twice a week, about 15 minutes. You're just gonna do a few exercises. It can be 8 to 10 types of exercise. You only have to do one set. I know some people think you have to do like 3 to 4 sets. No, it can just be one set of each of these, and it can be 10 or 15 to 15 minutes, right? You'd be done. And then think about ways that you can get in just a few more steps per day. And it doesn't have to be intentional exercise. So thinking about doing it through our household work, going for a walk with a friend, parking further away, doing an active game with your grandkid, right? All of these various things are ways that we can think about those unique situations that we don't have to spend additional time doing, but just squeeze it into our day to get in more steps. Okay, and then finally, so I'm actively doing a lot of this research, so we're always looking for participants. And so my main message too is that we can't do this without older adults. We can't do it, and it's been actually my favorite part of the research is working with older adults to answer these questions. And right now, I have a doctoral student who's helping me with a project where we're trying to use wearable technology to understand particularly older women's health and caregivers. So informal caregivers who are caring for somebody else, who are often neglecting their own health, and we want to be able to understand what is their health like through wearable technology. So if you are one of these people, or if you know of somebody who might be interested, we're actually looking for a few more people specifically for this study. Even if you're not applicable for this study and would like to share your information, we're always doing new studies and would love to keep you posted and share information as we're coming. So please visit me afterwards and would love to get your information and share a little bit more of what we're doing. Okay, so thank you so much for your time, and hopefully I'll give you some questions. Oh, thank you. Okay, what questions?
Do you practice what you preach? Do you
I
exercise?
I do. So I either walk, sometimes try to get in a run if I can, but I mostly walk. And I follow that resistance training. I don't go to a gym. I finish my walk and I go and I do my push-ups. I sometimes modify push-ups, right? Some sit-ups, some just like calf raises.
How about weights?
So if I have weights handy, I will. But a lot of times I don't. I don't even need weights, right? A lot of them you can just do, right? It's simple lunges, and all of these are modifiable to where you are starting. It doesn't have to be complicated. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I have a question. Do you study why the mortality is bigger in men than women in your study?
Oh, that's a great question. So we know from other things that women do tend to live longer, and there's a lot of biological mechanisms that are leading to that. So in terms of physical activity, we actually see that for both men and women, the benefits are similar, right? Women do tend to live longer regardless, but the benefits for physical activity on mortality are the same. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
I have a question about the data. You say that 6,000 to 7,000 steps a day, and then 150 minutes a day.
Yes.
It takes a lot longer than 150 to 6,000 and 7,000 a day.
It's a minimum, I think.
So that's a great question. So the 150, so it's kind of it's an or. So you could think about getting in your physical activity as 150 minutes per week, or which is great, if you like the duration and like maybe you're somebody who goes and swims, right? Then steps don't really apply to that, but you should get credit for that. So 150 minutes to 300 minutes, right? If that makes sense for you as an individual, then that duration-based, clock-based thing is great to try to get that in per week, right? So it's per week, it's not per day, 150 minutes per week. So that's about 22 minutes on average per day of a brisk walk, getting out, doing swimming laps, things like that. Or you could do steps, right? It could be or it could be a combination, A combination of the two, absolutely.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
But you have to choose for one is 6,000 to 7,000.
Yeah. If you get, there's actually been some recent evidence that we've been working on, as well as others, who have shown that 150 minutes is very similar to getting 6,000 to 8,000 steps per day. So in terms of like the health benefits, you see similar health benefits, whether you're doing one or the other.
One of the last graph give a point for different activities, and I saw that lipids one plus. Why not higher? Because normally cholesterol is the highest risk for heart disease.
Absolutely. So we have seen, so that's a good example of physical activity isn't going to solve every problem. It's going to help with lipids a little bit, but it's not, typically medication is going to help as well. There is some evidence that if you do both, that's the best. So if you're taking your medication and you're doing physical activity, that's where you're going to maximize your benefits for lipid control.
What was the average cholesterol level on the group that was studied?
So let's see, were you looking at this guy right here?
Yeah, I mean, on all the studies,
Yeah.
what is the average cholesterol and the upper and lower limit of the subjects that were studied?
So are you at like, what's the range of
The range, yes.
of the benefit?
Yeah, but I mean, all the studies are based on certain targets or certain what is the average for the group, and what was the average for the group?
Cholesterol
and
average.
cholesterol related to the physical activity.
Oh, yes. So we do see, reductions, but just not as much as for medication. So if you're doing, so that's kind of what we're seeing. But even doing resistance exercise or aerobic exercise alone, you'll see those reductions.
My question is related to not if there is reduction in lipid profile, but the studies are based on certain risk for certain factors for the people participating in the study. Some may be smokers, some may be risk, some may have cholesterol.
Oh, yes.
So my question is, on the cholesterol level, what was the range for the group that was studied?
Oh, so like what was the starting cholesterol?
Yeah, starting and
Oh,
the
the
range.
start and the range. That's a good question. So it varies. I'd have to look that up and let you know. So what this is based on, this is actually based on summaries of the variety of studies, but depending on the study, depending on what they're interested in, sometimes people are just taking general population, and so you have a wide range of cholesterol. Others are really trying to hone in on people who have high levels of cholesterol. And so that's a little difficult to answer that question because there's actually been a lot of studies out there, but you have a whole range of, and we do see that people who have higher cholesterol, those are the ones who see the greatest benefits, right? So if you can, if you can intervene with people who have the highest, that they have the most room to improve. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions?
This is an excellent presentation. Congratulations. Is any way to have a copy of your PowerPoint slides? Is any way to have a copy of
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. I'd be happy to share it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
When you were talking about frailty at the beginning, I'm thinking immediately of broken bones and breakable, but frailty is something different, is what I gather. It's about
Yes.
healthiness? Or?
Absolutely. So frailty could include that, right? Somebody who's more frail is more likely to have to see broken bones, but injuries. But it's more than that, right? So it is also about we use the term physiological reserve. So how much capability do you have to function in daily living? So that includes both our cardiovascular health, it includes our muscle strength, our bone strength, our mental capacity, all of those things. So just kind of our capacity to function throughout the day, and also to bounce back from, say, some type of, say we get an illness or we have a surgery, how well we are able to bounce back from that. So it's not just like frail bones, but it's in terms of, it's more like frail organs, frail muscles, all of those various things that contribute to how we are able to function in daily living. Yeah, that's a great question.
Is there a synonym that you would use for frailty? Is it weakness or vulnerability? Or?
Vulnerability is very good word for it. So how vulnerable are you to a stressor? You experience a stressor, how vulnerable are you to that? Are you going to be able to bounce back, or is it going to take months, or or maybe would you not be able to bounce back? So that's what we think about. It's that vulnerability. Yeah, good question and good term. Yeah, wonderful. Anything else? Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. All right. Wonderful.